Welcome to Discourse. I'm Sushil Pandey. The discourse of identity is on the rise of late in Nepali politics. The constitution writing process has been stagnated as political parties are at odds whether to federate the country along ethnic identities. Today I'm going to talk about the issue of identity and federalism, drawing references of the United States of America. My guest is Professor Dr. David H. Holmberg. He is a professor at Cornell University of the USA. He did his PhD dissertation on one of Nepal's ethnic communities, Tamang, and also interested in the discourse of identity and federalism prevailing in Nepali politics. Professor Holmberg, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Namaste.
As you know that Nepal is trying to promulgate new constitution, and identity-based federalism is one of the most contentious issues among the political parties. How do you perceive it?
It's a complex problem. There's no question about it. For me, I have my own point of view as an American, someone who comes from outside. I'm not a citizen of Nepal, but I have studied in Nepal beginning, I hate to admit this, 40-some years ago. I did my first major research in Nepal.
Maybe 1960s?
No, the first time I came into Nepal was in 1971, and I came for my research my main research in 1975 to 77, my initial main research. So that was just literally 40 years ago.
You did your PhD dissertation in Nepal's Tamang.
Yes, I did. I worked primarily in a Tamang community in the northwest corner of Nuwakot district, and I concentrated on the Tamang. And so I've worked with a group of people who've historically been excluded in Nepal. They were held in the area where I worked under forced labor regimes called Rukkam. They had to either work in fruit plantations in the Trasuli area, or they had to produce paper, or they had to carry loads, or they had to manage goat or herding stations for the royal families and carry butter to Kathmandu. And so they were a very oppressed people until the mid-1960s. They had to do this form of forced labor. Households probably, when you counted up all the different kinds of forced labor that they had to do, each household was having to contribute 100 or more person days of labor, either to the government or to local headmen. So they were a very oppressed population. You don't see many Tamang faces. In those days as well, they were not allowed to go, in the Rana period, they were not allowed to go higher than the level of Pipa, which was a very low position. And so they were historically excluded. They tend to be concentrated in certain areas of Nepal, particularly around the Kathmandu Valley.
It means you know very well about that marginalized community, especially Tamang community. And in Nepal now, there is a discourse of how to bring upward such kind of dominated and marginalized communities. The discourse is that in Constituent Assembly. And the political parties are making disputes. The federalist states, whether the federalist states are named after ethnic identity or not. What do you think about this?
I think the following, I guess. First of all power is economic, political power is concentrated in the Kathmandu Valley and tends to be in the hands of people from certain groups. And ever since I've been in Nepal, development experts have said if you want development in Nepal, you have to go down to the localities.
Decentralize.
You have to empower localities. Power has to be
decentralized.
And
it evolved from the bottom.
Yep. And this is what I think people have been saying, but it's never happened in Nepal. With the new constitution, there is the opportunity to shift power down. And I'm not up on the details that different parties are making about that particular kind of question, but in the abstract, devolving power down is very important. Now, if you also want if this is a critical thing for Nepal to do for its development, how you make federal units becomes an interesting kind of question, because if you want inclusiveness, For instance, if you took the Tamang, who tend to concentrate around the hills of the Kathmandu Valley, if you break the Tamang into, put some of them into this federal unit, some of them into that federal unit, some of them into this federal unit, the chances of them emerging, particularly in political life, the possibilities of them emerging become limited. One thing that will happen is if you just draw the boundaries to not break major ethnic cultural populations up, you're going to see parties having to become inclusive. Right now, parties tend to be not terribly inclusive, perhaps less inclusive. They've been getting less and less inclusive probably than they were even in the past. So you don't see many Adivasi Janajati, you don't see many Dalit, you don't see many women in the powerful positions in parties. If parties want to compete, if you have federal units where the boundaries more or less respect the natural sort of social, cultural units of the country, parties will have to become, all the parties will have to become more inclusive. They will have to recruit members. They will have to recruit candidates if they want to be competitive in elections. And this can only be good for Nepal. I mean, we have similar issues in the United States.
It means we should not break the cluster of ethnic community. Are you saying that? While federating the country, we should not divide the cluster of ethnic communities. Are you saying that?
I'm saying that. I think yes, I think that is one of the methods in which you can produce an inclusive context. But I'm a Democrat, Loktantrik Manche. I really believe that you have to be purely democratic in that process. Now, some radical leaders of some of the communities want, have a different kind of model. But I think mine would just be a fully democratic that recognizes natural, social, cultural groups. In fact, even in districts like Nuakot, which I know best, Tamang are an important population, but they're not in the census. It's something I think about. I didn't look at the actual numbers, but I think it's around 40% are Tamang, so they're not even a majority there. It's a very diverse community. Also, Tamang do not act as a bloc. They don't always vote the same. They're all members of different parties. You go to this village, they're following their leader, who happens to be, UML. You go to this village, they're following Congress. You go to this village. They don't act as a bloc in terms of their ethnic identity, which seems to be the fear of some people, that somehow this will happen. No, it'll just make, I believe it'll make the political system more inclusive, and it won't be sudden.
Okay. Let me one thing about what about identity politics in the United States of America?
Yes, we have similar kinds of difficulties. We have, if Nepal has a history of forced labor in Tamang communities, America has a history of slavery, and
especially in the black.
Yes, African Americans who were slaves, and they, even though it's been now 150 years since their freedom, and we fought a war internally to produce that freedom, the historical effect of slavery can still be felt today. And I think Nepal struggles with these issues as well. Things cannot be transformed instantaneously. So even though Nepal has a new political system, the residue of the old Rana system is still
prevailing in the community.
It's still there. You can still see that structure, and the structures of privilege that were produced at that time still operate. In America, we talk about white privilege, and it's true. I mean, it's the kind of privilege I had coming up in a family that valued education, a family, although they came themselves from poor circumstances, the doors were not closed to them. There's a kind of facility. It's easy for people who are white to negotiate their way into better positions in the United States, even to this day. They get into better colleges, they get into better universities, they get better jobs, they have connections into, and so it's a similar, you can do a comparison between Nepal and America. America is It's a continuing incredible difficulty,
Yeah.
even though we have a black president.
Does it mean that even America has the equal love for all? African American people are discriminated in one way or the other still?
Yes, we've just seen recently there was a case that may have made it into the Nepal press about the killing of a young black man
Ferguson?
in the state of Missouri, in a place called Ferguson.
Ferguson, yeah.
And there's just systematic police brutality in reference to African Americans.
Dominated by white mentality?
Yes, it's all white policemen for the most part in a black community, and they treat people quite miserably. And without any intervention, it seems to be a continuing factor, and there's a tremendous concern about this in the United States at this point.
What about the plight of indigenous people in the United States of America?
Well, of course, their plight begins with the coming of Europeans and the radical drop in the population of indigenous peoples in North America and South America. There are estimates of up to 80 million indigenous people lived in North and South America. Some of civilizations in the Americas were way more advanced than European civilizations at the time of contact. But through disease, through weapons, through all sorts of things, this population was decimated. 80 to 90% of the population was wiped out completely.
Literally killed?
Yes. Literally killed with guns or with disease. They used to give blankets with smallpox and infected indigenous populations who'd never had any experience with the disease, and very high rates of death. They were pushed from their lands. They were moved to different spaces in the United States. As European populations moved into North America, they came to exploit and extract.
When it happened?
This is shortly when you start getting colonial settlers. After, 1492, North America was, they say discovered, but it wasn't discovered because there were already people there who'd discovered it long before Europeans, but it was discovered for Europeans, 1492, and then beginning primarily in the 17th century, large numbers of people started to move to North America. And so yes, it's a terrible situation. Most indigenous peoples in the United States are confined in, or they have land, but it's on what we call reservations. They are usually quite impoverished, tremendous problems with alcohol.
Still, are they marginalized?
Yes, they are marginalized, primarily for the kinds of reasons that some sectors, not all sectors of indigenous populations in Nepal, they just simply don't have the access. There are tremendous social problems, which makes it difficult for young Native Americans. We call them Native Americans in the United States. In Canada, they're called First Nations. That makes it difficult. But they're also very strong. They're not just victims. There are real integrity to their cultures and societies, and there are lots of improvements being made in their situation. But because they're a huge minority, I think, I don't have the exact figures, but I think it's around 2 million to 3 million in a country that has now over 300 million people. It's not even 1% of the population. So it's not like Nepal, where the census says 37, but let's say it's probably more than that because the census
approximately 40%.
Yeah, something in that area, maybe more. I don't know. I'm sure some of my Adivasi indigenous colleagues would have a number that would make it much higher, but we don't have solid data at this point but let's say 40%, which makes them a population that cannot be ignored. The way I think largely indigenous peoples in the United States are completely ignored.
Professor Holmberg, political parties, they agree that, unanimously agree that we should not discriminate the people on the basis of their caste, their gender, their region where they live, and their ethnic identity. They agree this matter
But when the discussion of federating the country is concerned, one of the most contentious issues is whether to federate, to craft the federal state along the lines of ethnic identity or not. That is one of the most contentious issues in the present day Nepal.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, I see how it's contentious. I can understand, because people who hold power, economic, political power these days, they're afraid that in such a system that they will lose their privilege. I think this is one of the reasons why it
Will
makes
they
it
really
contentious.
lose that
Pardon?
privilege? Will they really lose that privilege?
No, I doubt it. It depends on how you structure things, and I can't imagine Nepal writing a constitution that would make that possible. I think that, I think the model, if it's a democratic model, as we were talking about before, it's going to end up just making things more inclusive on the political level. It's not going to disempower people who have been historically disempowered. There are very interesting studies in the United States about what we call affirmative action. It's not reservations like you find in South Asia, but we have what we call affirmative action. In other words, although this has now become limited in some ways by a Supreme Court decision, but affirmative action means you make a special opportunity for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now it can include class, ethnicity, identity, but you make it more possible. You look for the best in that group. A certain number of African Americans, even though, let's say, they're not quite as competitive because their educational backgrounds have not been quite as smooth. You look for people who have potential. You bring them into universities, you bring them into colleges, you bring them into the workplace. They have studied affirmative action because some white people have placed court cases, challenging this, saying, I didn't get into University of California at Berkeley because some African American took my place and they weren't as qualified as I was. They've done studies of this. There's absolutely no evidence that affirmative action has undermined the possibilities of people from other backgrounds. It's just brought a tremendous number of people into politics and into greater society. Not the number we want. President Obama himself has said that he is a product of affirmative action. He personally was a product. He's president of the United States, and has done, for my opinion, wonderful. He's had, he's been a good president. So, people who are scared, they're afraid that their children might not, get a position in school, or their children might not get the job, or because we know that in Nepal, many things work on the social connections.
But Professor Holmberg, ironically, they are not talking about to give preferential right or reservation. They are just talking about how to name the federal state.
Yes.
Nepali political parties, the discourse of Nepal is like that.
Yeah, well, I think I think the people who are currently in dominant positions should just relax. And what people are asking for in a name is just that they be recognized, that they be recognized as true Nepal citizens, and that they are a part of the mosaic of Nepal, an important part of the mosaic of Nepal. A name is part of, it says, look, these people exist. They're an important population in this district. They have not historically been recognized. In the United States, we have states, many states named after indigenous
For
groups.
example?
North Dakota, South Dakota, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Connecticut, on and on. These are all, even the street I live on is called Taghanic Boulevard. Taghanic is an indigenous term from the Iroquois.
They are named after ethnic identities.
Yes. And likewise, the lake I live beside the lake is named using the indigenous term. See, for people who are in the Adivasi Janajati community, the Nepali names that have been applied to their villages, to their districts, were imposed on them.
Yeah, it means you are arguing that Nepali federal state should be named after ethnic identity.
The name is a trivial matter in a way, but as we say in anthropology, yes, it's a symbol, but symbols are important. And I think that this would be a kind of way of producing an environment where that says, look, Nepal is in fact a very multicultural place, and a recognition of that multiculturalism in the names is symbolically important.
Can I interrupt you,
Sure,
Professor
please.
Holmberg?
You can interrupt me anytime.
Okay. I have studied your famous book, Order in Paradox. You have researched Nepal and wrote on the basis of Nepali Tamang people, ethnic community. And there, I read that you argued the very old Tamang is comparatively reconstructed. It means the identity, Tamang identity, is always at the state of flux. At the time changes, it gets changed.
Yes.
As historically their identity gets changed, so will be in the future.
Yes.
On the basis of your argument, is it appropriate to name federal state on such name, which is always itself in the state of flux?
Well, look, I'm not a citizen of Nepal, so I don't really have a position on the naming. As I say, ultimately...
No, I'm just...
But from my perspective in this question of the transformation, the change of cultures through time...
identity also gets changed as the change of time. Yeah?
Yes, but if you look at the sort of this question of human rights, the right to be different, people can transform. I can give you a wonderful example of how this can happen. When we initially did our research in the mid-1970s with Suryaman Tamang as our research associate and someone we worked with for a very long time, there were certain kinds of song styles in the village. And as very few of the girls went to school, they would go out cutting fodder or herding animals. They'd always be singing these songs, and these songs would be sung in festivals. But as education became more important, children started going to school, a lot of those songs people were no longer singing. Well, in the I think it was the mid-1990s, after Jan Andolan Ek, and when organizations of Adivasi Janajati started to form, there was a Tamang Yuva group, Mendomaya Yuva group from the western area of Tamang, Nuakot district, and they wanted copies of the old songs. So we put them onto a disc and gave them to them, and then they remixed those songs. And if you go to some of the big Lochar celebrations or other celebrations of the Tamang community, you will hear these old songs remixed, blasting out over loudspeakers with people dancing a modified style of what the old dances were. So here's a point of transformation that we can see in Tamang culture and also in Tamang identity, because many Tamang have migrated into the city of Kathmandu. They're the third largest population in Kathmandu. Lots of people are no longer living in the village. So there's transformation throughout society, there's transformation throughout culture. But the question becomes, change is always happening. Identities are always being constructed and reconstructed. And everyone in Nepal is going through a reconstruction of their own identity right now because of the new circumstances, also transformations in society. But people have a right to change, to transform their cultures. That still keeps them as distinct cultures, because you play those Tamang songs, they have very little meaning for other Nepalis probably, but they have a huge meaning for the identity of Tamang. They're a new kind of song, and it's a new kind of Tamang identity, but it's still definitely a Tamang identity. And so that this notion of if people have the right, that as human beings, we're all cultured beings. If we have a right to culture as a group, then we also have the right to transform that culture through time and into the future. So I don't think that particular argument that cultures are constructed, and identities are constructed and transformed, undermines anything having to do with the naming of a particular federal unit. Those people will still exist, those cultures still exist, perhaps in transformed form, if you understand my basic argument.
Today, I've talked with Professor Dr. David S. Holmberg, Professor of Cornell University of the USA, about identity and federalism. This is the first part of the show. In the next part, I'll again talk with Professor Holmberg about constitution writing process of Nepal, along with identity-based federalism. Thanks for watching. Stay with us. Goodbye and namaste.